For me, organic food has been a long-standing interest, and the lack of organic farming a long-standing concern. My own interest goes back not just to my days as environmental campaigning in the 70s and early 80s, but also my first academic job was actually in a department of home economics, where I was teaching young students about organic food. Many of them who hadn't even heard of the term, was going back now to the late 80s, early 90s. So it's always been a topic of which I have had a real interest and a real desire to see an expansion. So it's a particular pleasure then to have Guy Singh-Watson speak to us today. Guy is one of the leading national experts in this area, practically as a farmer, but also as a businessman, setting up Riverford. Is it Riverford Food or Riverford Farms? I never quite know how you like to style it.
Riverford Organic Farmers, we call ourselves.
There we go. I won't say anything at all about it because I'm sure Guy will be telling you about his journey, setting the business up, and also saying a bit more about what it's like to be in the organic field today. So in no more ado, over to you, Guy. And thank you very much indeed for coming and giving up your time tonight.
Thank you, Tim. And thank you, Kat, for asking me to speak and organising this. I think I'm probably going to speak for 20 minutes or half an hour and leave lots of time for questions. And so I've just got some slides, really, mainly of my farm and a few other farms, which I'm going to take you through now, if this works. So yeah, I've titled my "Trying to be Useful," which is the guiding value, which I think I inherited from my father and has seen me through my farming career, and indeed I think it is the principal, I suppose, value that has driven my business. So and indeed my values, like most people, came very early in life from my parents. My father was a very innovative farmer who started farming at Riverford in South Devon. He took on a Church of England tenancy in 1951, and my mum was just an amazing cook. She also studied agriculture at Reading, but yeah, she was largely confined to the kitchen, as was the way at that time. I had 5 children, and we're all back on the farm today running various food and farming business. So that absolute love of food and a sort of passion for farming, and probably a fairly challenging way of farming, not following the crowd, are values that came from my parents. And it may be worth saying that, when he started farming, food rationing was, still there in 1951 after the war. He came back from the empire, didn't have an empire anymore, so had to do something, and decided to be a farmer, wanted to do something useful. What could be more useful than producing food? So as I say, they had 5 children. I'm the youngest on the right. We're all back on the farm. And after, God, how long have I been at it? Since 1987. I've been growing organic vegetables on the farm. It was principally a dairy farm, though my father had kept sheep and chickens and grown grain. And made cider, and it was a proper mixed farm, as most farms in our area and probably across the country were at that time. But I've specialised in growing vegetables organically, and after a few years, I decided to sell them directly to our customers through a veg box scheme, which was started in 1993. So that's a view of the farm looking up towards Dartmoor. That's the Dart Valley running down the bottom there, and that's one of our fields of lettuces. It's quite an old photograph, but we grow a tremendous variety of crops, and they're all tailored for what we anticipate to be the needs of our veg boxes over the next 12 months. In fact, October is the month where we plan our cropping, both on our own farms and on the 80 or so farms across the UK and indeed Europe that supply us now. We only grow about 6% of what we sell now, but farming is very much in our blood. And in fact, it's written in our constitution that we will always farm, that we won't do what many farmers who develop brands do, which is really just stop farming and buy everything in from everyone else. I'll probably come back to that theme. I do have a very strong passion for farming in the UK, and in particular smaller family farms, which I believe to be the sort of backbone of many rural communities, and also an essential part of farming and environmentally sensitive way. So there we go. That's back to 1987. I came back. I spent 2 years as a management consultant in New York for my sins, and I came back having got fed up with that. With it, I will say, with the moral bankruptcy of what I was doing, really. And I wanted to, I suppose, very much like my father, I wanted to do something useful with my life. I came back to the farm, decided to grow vegetables, decided to grow them organically. I have to say, at that time in 1987, I think my thoughts were shaped more by being a management consultant and looking for a growth market than by any ethical concerns. That came later. I mean, over whatever it is, getting on for 40 years, I just wouldn't farm any other way today. And perhaps I should define what I mean by organic farming. Let's see what the next slide is. No, that's not a suitable one. To my mind, organic farming is farming in partnership with nature and trying to learn from nature, sometimes to mimic it. Certainly not wishing to dominate it, displace it, and put really a pretty alien system in its place, which I think is what most of modern agriculture is, growing a monocrop crop, highly dependent on external inputs of fertilizers and pesticides. So it can be, some people define it as growing food without the use of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, which is mostly true, but it's a very negative definition, and I'd rather define it as, as I say, learning from and farming in partnership with nature. So I sold to local shops for a few years, and then wholesalers in London. And as the business grew, I ended up selling to Sainsbury's and Waitrose. I absolutely hated it. I mean, actually, Waitrose were very decent to deal with. Sainsbury's certainly weren't, and I got treated very badly, really, as I think most farmers still do today. And this is the poet and philosopher, I suppose you might say, Walt Whitman, 19th century American poet. Anyway, and I love this thing. Re-examine all of you've been told and dismiss what insults your soul. I find it a very good guide in life, actually, and I don't believe anyone should treat another human being as a supermarket buyer treats farmers on a regular basis. And it did insult my soul, and I decided I wasn't going to do it. And I did, after 10 years or so, swear that, I was not going to do this. I was going to get out of it. And the development of our veg box scheme, selling direct to customers, enabled us to do that. So first veg box in 93, and again, another shot of the farm. This is one of our steeper south-facing fields. It'll be about 25% slope. We're harvesting cabbages there. We do typically work in teams of 8, a lot of hand harvesting. We will mechanize what we can, but the lack of conformity in organic crops, they tend to be more varied, does make mechanization probably more challenging than it is for the rest of the industry. But I'm not a Luddite. I mean, I want to make organic food affordable to everyone, and in order to get anywhere close to that, we have to embrace technology. So I don't believe there's anything wrong with using GPS guided tractors and computer aided recognition of weeds on our weeding equipment or anything like that. We actually employ about 20 software engineers to work on our website and so on. So I don't accept the often criticism that's fired at organic farmers of being a bunch of Luddites. I just don't believe that the only way forward lies, in a chemical container or a fertilizer sack. And I think I mentioned already that I particularly like and want to support smaller scale farming and family farms in the UK. So as the business started growing and our sales took off and the organic market started developing through the 90s, I did actually found a co-op of farmers in South Devon and helped them convert and marketed their produce, which has been very successful. It still runs. It's actually not officially a co-op anymore, but still runs in the same sort of way. I just don't really like the dehumanizing effect of large businesses. Today, well over 50% of the salads eaten in this country are grown by one company. I don't think most people are aware of the concentration that's happened in farming and the drive towards ever greater scale and ever greater specialization. And I think with it have come, some pretty substantial costs that I'll probably come back to. So I'm very much a fan of cooperation. working closely with farmers. So we have that group of farmers in Devon that supply about 30% of what we sell, but we also work with growers. This is in Southern Europe, in particular in Spain, and in particular in Andalusia. So this is Paco, who grows spinach here, but he also grows a lot of asparagus for us. And yeah, a smallish family farm just south of Granada. And we've been working with him, must be for 25 years. I think we sell most of what he grows, and I consider him a personal friend, as I do many of our suppliers. So our sort of supply chain and our relationship with the people who supply Riverford is very much based on long-term relationships, good cooperation, and trust and friendship, actually. And I'd really like to take some of these sort of stress, and I consider, really unnecessary stress that is placed on farmers by their relationships with their main customers. And 90% of food in the UK is sold through the big six supermarkets. They are the principal customers, and they are unspeakably unpleasant to deal with. And we're very different to that. And so part of the Riverford success, I think, has been about telling the story about how we grow food and so on. So right from the growers on one end, like Paco, really trying to take the story right through into people's kitchens. And we employ quite a few chefs developing recipes and helping our customers eat the vegetables, because a vegetable box is not, most people, especially with declining cooking skills in this country, do struggle a bit sometimes with eating their way through those seasonal vegetables every week. And we also have a restaurant on the farm. This is the Field Kitchen in South Devon, which has been open for, I think, about 20 years now, and won lots of awards. And it's I know it's one of the things I'm very proud of. And really, they're big long sharing tables, and very much the same style of food and food service that my mother used to use, half a century earlier, when she fed most of the people who worked on the farm who came in for lunch. And at that time, it was all about sharing. There was food wasn't a divisive thing. Good food wasn't, ridiculously expensive. And I'd have to say, I'd love to get back to that. I aspire to it, but I'm not going to pretend that Riverford vegetable boxes are cheap. Farming well, is more expensive, and looking after your employees properly is also more expensive, and delivering in an electric vehicle rather than a diesel one is also more expensive. So anyway, I hope I'm sort of maybe being a bit provocative and hoping things will come up in questions. We then took this on anyway, I'm going to skip over this because it's not really about organic farming, and I'm starting to wonder whether I've opened the wrong slide presentation because it doesn't have the slides that I have. But I'll carry on anyway. For the last 25 years, I had worked with farmers, principally in Uganda, a little bit in Kenya, through the charity Send a Cow, which has now renamed itself Ripple Effect. And I went there 20 years ago because 25 years ago, I just got fed up with people telling me that organic farming is all very well for you affluent, Westerners, but it's never going to feed the world, is it? So I thought I would go and take a look for myself. And I spent 2 months traveling around Kenya and Uganda, visiting large, expat growers, but mostly small subsistence farmers. And I came back with a very firm opinion that organic farming could feed the world, and particularly in areas of low incomes and food insecurity, it could do that a damn sight better than conventional farming and conventional supply chains. And I've worked with Send a Cow, now Ripple Effect, ever since, and given a good slice of my income and capital to them, and probably raised about £2 million in total to support their work. And I'll be going there again next month. And the reason I love what they do is the sort of patience of their approach. And they tend to run very long-term projects, at least 3 years, and they're mostly run by local people, almost exclusively. And their focus is on soil health, composting, diversity of cropping, helping farmers acquire the skills to save their own seed, make compost, moisture conservation techniques. They dig these trenches in, particularly in the higher rainfall areas, is a very important part of, and integrating livestock into their farming. So the cows are kept and prized actually probably more for their urine and feces than they are for the milk and beef. And it's a sort of integrated system, and I think they're absolutely great. So and actually, out of my last trip, I came back with an absolute obsession, perhaps, with getting more of our food from perennial crops. One of the great problems with organic farming is that we tend to cultivate the soil, possibly even more than conventional farmers. And every time you plow the soil, you release carbon dioxide, you disturb the mycorrhizal fungi and the bacteria, and it's a very destructive, you might almost say sort of violent act, and the soil would be much happier if we didn't do that. And one way of doing that is to grow our food from perennial crops, which don't require this annual cultivation to make a seed bed. So this is papayas, which grow fantastically well in Uganda, but actually most of their calories come from plantains, which are another perennial, cassava, yams, typically there for several years, certainly the cassava. Unfortunately, they are being, there's quite a lot of pressure on them one way or another to grow maize, which I think is a great shame. I think it's one of the world's most destructive crops, and I'm happy to come back to that if anyone has questions. So back to our farm. I mean, I mentioned that the problem with organic farming, I mean, I have no doubt that our soils are healthier, that they have, because we're not putting fertilizers and fungicides and insecticides on, they have much more life in them, a much more variety of bacteria and fungi and invertebrates, and much more in number and biomass as well. And as a result, they tend to have a much more open structure, which means that rain percolates down through them quicker and we get less runoff. However, this is a picture taken in the same position as one I showed you earlier of those guys harvesting cabbages. And it was after a catastrophic thunderstorm in early September about 3 years ago, and we lost about an inch of soil off a 40-acre field in about 10 minutes. And it's just made me think, and you can see some of it at the bottom of the field there, and some of it just got washed away and ended up in the River Dart. And I wept with shame that this has happened on my watch, and I determined that I had to learn how to farm differently. So this field is now in permanent pasture, intercropped with hazelnuts, which I will come back again. So both perennial crops. It will never be ploughed again. It's just too high risk given the climate changing rainfall patterns we're seeing with climate change. And actually, September, which is the time when we would have been resowing this with grass, is when we are increasingly getting torrential thunderstorms. It does seem to be a developing weather pattern. So I try and mix things up as much as possible. Again, this is something that I probably was influenced by those Ugandan farmers. So this is a cider orchard interplanted with globe artichokes, which was one of my projects. It was reasonably successful. And I mean, the theory being that the more diversity you have, the less you're going to have outbreaks of any particular pest or disease. So, I mean, if I take the example of aphids, and they can be a real problem in artichokes, but if you have a really rich biodiversity, there are always lots of ladybirds, lacewings, hoverflies, which will feed on those aphids. So it's our job as organic farmers, and maybe even some conventional farmers are getting wise to that, to maintain the flowering plants in our hedgerows, or sometimes in strips down the field, that the lacewing and hoverfly adults feed on, and then they will lay their eggs in the crop, which will hatch out and chomp their way through the aphids. And it is we have done studies on this with Plymouth University and found actually that this was just as effective as spraying with Savona, which soap. It's just which organic farmers were allowed to use. I think they are still allowed to use. We haven't used it for about 15 years since that study, because we found that 2 weeks after spraying, And we had various, it was done in a scientific, replicable way that actually there was no reduction in the aphids in the plots that had been sprayed, because the problem was that the Savona killed the ladybirds, lacewings, and hoverflies. And so that any surviving aphids just bred like crazy, and it ended up not helping at all, actually. And we have never used, I think I'm fair in saying, we have never used an insecticide on the farm since. We do use various forms of biological controls, in particular parasitic wasps we release, which are very effective at controlling. They lay an egg inside each aphid, and they're very effective at controlling aphids on our polytunnel crops, so tomatoes and cucumbers and so on. But this sort of mixing it up, and I mentioned at the beginning, trying to learn from nature and mimic it, and trying to incorporate as many perennial crops as possible is pretty key to the way that we are farming now, and I think it's certainly key to our future. So we are a predominantly a livestock area. Devon, high rainfall area, grows grass fantastically well. So, dairy is the predominant industry. These are South Devons, which 50 years ago might have been milked, but they're now kept as suckler cows for produce very good beef. And this is one of our fields where I do love seeing them grazing on in the fields, but I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that there is an issue with very extensive farming like this. Organic beef probably produces about 100 kilos of beef an acre a year, probably a bit less than that, actually, maybe between 50 and 100. So very low levels of output. And certain people would argue that that land would be better off rewilded, planted with trees that will sequester carbon and address climate change. And of course, cows do produce methane, which contributes quite substantially to climate change, though the maths on that is quite complex, and I don't really agree with a lot of things that are said. I'm happy to talk about the place of animals in farming, and indeed whether we should all be vegans and so on. If anyone wants to ask a question at the end, just going to check how I'm doing for time. Oh, I think I better speed on. So I decided to. This is a walnut tree that I planted actually when my first daughter was born, so it's 34 years old. Grown very, very well, and I have now decided to plant many of those pastures, like the one you've just seen, in an agroforestry scheme, where we have planted. This is a walnut tree and hazels as well, with 2 rows of electric fence and cattle grazing in between, and even taking fairly modest yields, we'll get about 400 kilos of shelled nuts per acre, compared to the 50 or 100 tons of 100 kilograms of beef. So it'll increase production by 5 times. It will increase more biodiversity. It will fix carbon. I think it's the sort of way. This is what I would truly regenerative farming. It's not a term that I use very much, but this would be one a good application of the word regenerative, I would say. That's another one, more or less same hazels, and you can see the hare there. The hares do love this field. I also farm in France. This is where we grow a lot of. I have a lot of. I've always argued a bit about the idea that local food is always the best way to go. There is a strong argument for growing crops where they like to be grown. So these chili peppers are grown outside. Our peppers and aubergines also, there's no fossil fuel usage, whereas most in this country, growing them in the UK and burning fossil fuels would have something like 10 times the carbon footprint, even having accounted for transporting them back to the UK. I haven't spoken much about the business, but I do have some issues with capitalism. I suppose I'm a reluctant capitalist. I'm clearly good at it. I've built a very successful business with £100 million turnover. But over the years, I've become increasingly uncomfortable with the idea that I'm the primary beneficiary of that. That's how, stakeholder capitalism works. And 6 years ago, Riverford became employee owned. I sold it to the staff for about a quarter of what the accountants told me it was worth, and they paid me off. They've done very well, actually. They paid me out much quicker than expected. I've only got a couple more years to go, and they'll have paid it all off. And it is a wonderfully successful business with really engaged co-owners, and I feel that the business is in safe hands. I mean, if anything, I notice the way they make decisions, it's probably become more truly ethically driven than it was under my ownership. I'm still a non-executive director and work there, and from my farm in France and farm in Devon, I supply them. And we do it our way is our sort of motto. The we was the stronger together. The doing it is the importance of doing all things well. I'm afraid I've seen too many values-driven businesses that don't put enough focus on actual competence. And our way is that we are independent, and we'll copy the way other people do business up to a point until, to quote Walt Whitman, it insults my soul, and then we'll do it our own way. So we are independent in our thought and sometimes quite challenging. And that's me and my wife, Geeti. Having sold Riverford, I did think that I would retire with my dog. They are swimming in our reservoir and have an easy life, but I don't seem to be able to do that. So on this farm where we moved to, we are now growing vegetables again. And Geeti has a pub and inn in Totnes, which is absolutely wonderful. The Bull Inn, if anyone ever comes to Devon, couldn't recommend it highly enough. We talked about the walnuts. We're a B Corp. I'm happy to talk about that if anyone is interested, but I'm not going to labour now. This is more about perennial crops and being challenging and doing things our own ways. So the top slide there is cardoons, which I think I'm probably the only commercial producer of cardoons. They've got quite a bitter vegetable, which can be cooked a little bit like celery. On the left, we forage wild garlic, about £100,000 worth every year from woods in South Devon, and I would argue that it's one of the most sustainable foods that we can produce. Some people have a problem that is a natural crop, and that we are, our rapacious greed is taking this from a natural situation. And if anyone wants to ask me a question about that, I'm happy to try and justify what we do. Tomatillos is another crop we've imported from Mexico, and we have a carbon. We put a lot of effort over the last, God, it's almost 20 years now since we did our first carbon footprint, and we've continued to do this and reduce the carbon intensity of what we do. I mean, not everything can be measured in carbon, but it is probably, I would say, climate change is the biggest threat to our civilization and our planet, and I think we all need to be mindful of the impact of what we do, and we are driving down the carbon impact of what we do in various ways. We import less. We import from not so far away. We don't use any heated glass. We don't use any air freight. We use compostable packaging. We reuse our packaging, a lot of it. I think we're about the only people who do that. We take it back and reuse it, and it is all recycled at the end of its life. And I think we've been well ahead of when we did our first carbon footprint, there was really no agreed way to do it. For instance, this is just, I'd say this to everyone that I meet. If we want to solve climate change, it's perfectly clear what we need to do. We just need to tax fossil fuels that cause 89% of climate change. And how we have managed to have 21 COPs, or is it even 22, and we only get to speak about fossil fuels in the, in 59th minute of the 11th. Well, it's just absurd, really. And all economists, know that this is the way to solve the problem. But our political and economic systems have been so captured by the fossil fuel industry that it's just remarkable. I'm fairly gloomy, I'm afraid. I've been at this 20 years campaigning on this, and it's so obvious what we need to do, and no one wants to do it. I'm almost despairing, really. And at 64, I like to think that I'm still learning. So they'll think you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I completely disagree with. I think I'm learning just as much I do at 64 as I was at 16. And I think this is a message this is a photograph on the right of us on Employee Ownership Day 6 years ago, which was, probably the happiest and proudest day of my life. And I'm particularly happy that my father, in a wheelchair at the front, lived to see it, because he was very supportive of my move into organic agriculture, and also of the move to employee ownership. And the key to, saving our planet, I think, are absolutely critical to it. I think two things are honesty. I think we accept, terrible practices of lying, both commercially and politically, and we're never going to address the serious problems we have while people are, prepared to greenwash. And I think people who have wealth and influence just desperately need to set a better example. So the picture on the left is a boat that I built with my friend for £1,200 15 years ago, and I always swear that I get more pleasure from that boat than all the idiots bouncing around off Start Point, which is where this photograph was taken, in their huge power boats, which I would dearly like to scuttle and send to the bottom of the English Channel. And I think that's my last slide. So I hope I've been lots provocative, and there'll be lots of questions. And I've spoken for about 30 minutes, which was about it. So maybe I'll stop sharing. And how do I do that? There we go.
That's great. Thanks so much, Guy. Tim is going to chair our Q&A session, but just before he does, I'm just tearing the microphone out of his hands for a second, because you made a comment about organic farming being more expensive. And I can see that Angie's put a comment in the chat about not cheap, but well worth it. And it seems to me, I don't know whether you've got a view on it, that it's not that organic farming is expensive, but that rubbish food with lots of externalized costs and human and animal misery is ridiculously cheap, cheaper than it should be. And I've just been looking at a slide from Our World in Data, which shows that at the end of 2022, Brits spent 8.5% of their disposable income on food, whereas people in most other countries, including developed ones, spent a hugely higher proportion of their disposable income on what they put in their mouths. Ukraine was spending something like 30 or 40%.
So I mean, even in France, it's 15%. I think the US and possibly Australia are the only countries that spend a lower proportion of GDP on food. And it's relentlessly gone down. And it's actually worse than that, Kat, because from the farmer's point of view, I mean, it may be 8.5%. That is the lowest I've ever heard anyone quote, but I think it does depend on these things a little bit, where you draw the envelope and how you measure it. However, the proportion of that 8.5% that goes back to farmers has declined relentlessly. So now we're at that roughly 15 pence in every pound you spend on food will go back to a farmer. It's about 15%. Yeah. And, you know, for vegetables, it's about 25% on average. It used to be, when I started farming, close to 40%. So it has, you know, so why it's not a Newtonian rule of physics that the primary producer should always be the one that gets squeezed. I mean, all the food inflation around Ukraine, you know, we were told it was driven by fuel prices and rising fuel inputs, and food went up by, I think, 20% a year for 2 years, and then more like 10% the third year. Farmers saw very, very little of that. If they saw 5% a year, I would be surprised. Supermarkets and the middlemen gobbled up the rest. So it is, let's be under no illusion that we pay what it costs to produce something. We pay what the person selling you can get away with charging for it. That, you know, that's how the world we live in works. Yep. So thanks for that, Kat.
Oh, I'm going to invite questions. I can't see up at the moment, but let me just throw in one for myself, which is, given your extensive experience over many years, when I started teaching in the 1990s about organic food, the market was tiny, and today the market is tiny. You know, we're talking about 3% of UK land is organic, but 3 billion sales. I don't know what the total number of sales of food are, but it's still very, very small. It's
it has grown.
What do you see as the prospect for change? Because it is partly about people's values. You know, we can win about food being cheap, but at the end of the day, how do we change that? And what do you see as levers?
Well, it has grown. In the 1990s, towards the end of the 1990s, the organic market in the UK was about 100 million. Riverford turns over 100 million today. So, I mean, it has, it's to now just, I think, about a bit over 2 billion. So it has grown, but you're right. It is still, it's certainly less than 3%. I think it's probably closer to 2% of the market, maybe 3% of the land farmed. That is probably one of the lowest percentages in any developed country. So in Austria, I think it's well over 10%. In Germany, Denmark, around about 10%. I think France, 6-7%. I mean, even Italy, don't know why I say even Italy, but I mean, I think it's about 4% last time I looked. So it is, yeah, we are definitely way behind, and we generally, the press was very supportive until about 2007, and then we have this narrative, and it's come up again the last couple of years around food poverty, and to possibly ask people to pay more for their food is almost sort of immoral. And certainly, we are written off as being, a middle class industry, blah 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 blah, exclusive. I just find it so frustrating when actually the problem is not the cost of producing it anyway, it's the cost of packaging it and the supermarket's margins and so on. That's where, as I say, 85% of the money is going anyway. So if farmers got paid a bit more for producing better food, it really wouldn't make any difference, very little difference. And the term food poverty, which is so often used, it just infuriates me. We have poverty in this country. Not fuel poverty, not food poverty. We just have poverty, and we have grotesque inequality, and that's the problem. Not the cost of growing organic food. Which I'll just rant on a little bit more. Which in industry, which contributes over 50% of biodiversity loss, and many people would suggest 30% of climate change, yet only contributes 1.6% to GDP. To be focusing on price, we clearly are focusing on the wrong thing. We should be. There are so many other goods and services that farming could be providing, if we had a sensible, food farming policy. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got a question from Judith. You're on mute at the moment.
A couple of weeks ago, I took part in a march with a group called Wildcard. We went to St. Paul's Cathedral to demand that the church commissioners rewild 30% of their land by 2030. I've since asked them to clarify what they meant by rewilding, and they very definitely meant restoring it to nature without any farming. Yeah. And I wondered if we are going to rewild 30% of farmland in that way, to what extent will we have to change our diets?
Yeah.
And then the other question that relates to that is, actually, can in fact farming and increasing biodiversity coexist, like you had with the fields of nut trees and flowers?
Well, I absolutely believe that it can. Incidentally, the church commissioners, my father was a church tenant, and he used to be a church warden through the 50s and 60s, and he got so fed up with them that he, with their very unchristian behaviour, actually, that I'm afraid he did renounce his belief and stop going to church.
Yeah.
I found it too hypocritical. However, and they haven't. I mean, they are not wonderful landlords. As a matter of fact, they've sold most of their land in the West Country now. The farm where we farm and where many of our suppliers farm was all church commission. Well, a lot of it was almost all the parish was church commission, and it's been sold. And they were pretty dreadful, but worse, actually, just completely incompetent landlords. So I'm afraid. I'm sorry, I've just been told, Geeti, is that I need the battery's going low, but but yeah, on to rewilding. I am trying to get the lead, which might have, I'm going to move my computer a little bit, or you're gonna lose me. There we go. That'll save us. Rewilding. I think there is a place for it. I think particularly in upland Britain, where we have very unproductive, we have a huge amount of land producing very little food in the way of suckler beef and lamb. And I'm not advocating rewilding all of that. However, you could rewild a significant chunk of it without it making really much impact on the food produced in this country. So Dartmoor, which is, I think, one of my early slides, our farm runs up to the boundary of Dartmoor, I suppose. And it definitely should be. I mean, the valleys around the rivers and so on, should be rewilded. They should be wooded, and that would add to biodiversity. I have to say there is change of pace. I don't think it's as heavily grazed as it was, and I do notice some more regeneration of trees on the moor. So I think things are improving, but I think we could see a lot more of that in the steeper, thinner soiled west of Britain. I'm not an advocate of rewilding significant areas of lowland Britain, as advocated by, the Knepp estate and so on, probably the most famous example. I mean, I think all we're doing is, where it's productive land, all we're doing is pushing our food needs onto, other countries which probably have less favored climates, where it's going to be more damaging, and I think it's irresponsible. I think it's the preserve of a wealthy elite, quite largely. I think it's become a bit of a status symbol in some cases to rewild your estate. It's another form of, almost sort of colonialism, really. I think some of the rewilding and carbon capture movement, and I think we need to be careful of it. However, I do think there is a lot to be said for rewilding corridors and making sure that we connect areas of wildlife and enable wildlife to move through the climate. And that could be probably done with 5% of lowland Britain, and it could probably be the less productive 5%. So, allowing hedges to sprawl out and get wider, which is a big thing in Devon. We have the most wonderful hedges, allowing streams and rivers, banks to become wooded, which would also massively increase water quality. So I think, it can be used intelligently, but the idea that we're going to rewild, large areas of lowland Britain, even the Knepp estate, which has some fairly sticky clay and probably not the best arable land, I don't support that, I'm afraid. Did you say something? I can't remember where the diet. Yes, you did say something about changing diet, didn't you? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not a vegetarian. I'm not a vegan. I do challenge the idea that ruminants are responsible for getting on ruminants, cows, sheep, goats, and so on, and their enteric production of methane is responsible for 20% of climate change. I'm afraid that's just not true. I mean, as long as we have the same number of ruminants, they're not contributing anything to climate change. That's not to say if we went and shot all of them, it would reduce. There would be a temporary cooling, which might be useful given the desperate states. But I do find it really annoying that this figure is quoted over and over again, and it's just not true. It's just mathematically incorrect. I can go into the details of why it's mathematically incorrect, but there is a paper published by Oxford University that is, it's just wrong, and it's astounding that something that is so wrong is repeated so frequently. Having said that, I think there are much stronger arguments for eating less meat around, because there is, it takes up so much space to produce. I mean, particularly in the soya, which gets fed in vast quantities to our particularly pigs and chickens, and so much of it comes from the Amazon and Argentina, and vast areas have been deforested and savannas ploughed up to produce something so that we can all eat ridiculous amounts of animal protein. So I mean, probably to try and live sustainably on this planet, the wealthy, who typically consume about 1.5 kilos of, figures right, 1.5 kilos of meat a week, probably need to drop that to about 0.5 kilo. We've got a third our meat consumption, and one can argue whether that should be chicken and pork, which is the most efficient turner of soya and wheat into protein, or whether it should be beef, which the argument there is that it's grazing areas that can be used to grow food for human consumption. But anyway, it's quite a complex argument. But to my mind, there is no question that if we want to live sustainably on this planet, we should be eating a lot less meat, and probably eggs and dairy as well.
There are a number of questions in the chat. We won't go through all of them. And do please feel to use the raise hand facility if you want to get my attention. But I'll pick one or two out of the chat. And one in particular is about, do you have more hope for a better food strategy with the new government? And I just thought in terms of elms and the sort of the way you're hinting at? Is that like a challenge? And in fact, if I could just amplify that, but you mentioned regenerative, is perhaps one of the reasons why organic isn't growing so much is because there is this kind of muddying of waters. The government's going to help people who do a little bit more to the environment.
I think it's too early to say about this government. You know, I was tremendously optimistic when they were elected, primarily because I have lived most of my adult life under a neoliberal government, you know, neoliberal capitalist-driven market-based economics, which has been, you know, obviously came in with Maggie Thatcher. You know, but Tony Blair, you know, followed the same script really, and obviously then we had 14 years of Tory rule where it just reached the most absurd, you know, heights of, you know, it's just become ridiculous that the market has the answer to everything, be it healthcare, education, you know, or food. And but the problems that we face in all those areas are so nuanced and complicated that, and you know, market forces are a very, very blunt instrument. It's just not going to work. So I think until we abandon that, or at least question it, or and are willing to regulate appropriately, I'm afraid I am fairly gloomy, and the jury's out on this government. I am upset by their lack of any sort of moral stance, particularly over civil liberties, where they seem to be following on where the Tories left off. And anyway, I'm not going to condemn them. The Zeichner is the Food and Agriculture Minister, Environment Minister. He seems like a pretty decent bloke, but you know, so did Ed Miliband. I've got a lot of time for, but why on earth they're putting money into carbon capture, I don't know. I think, you know, we've had government capture by the fossil fuel industry, I think. So I don't know. Their environmental credentials, I think we're going to have to wait and see, but I don't think it's looking great so far.
If there's one policy measure that you would like them to introduce to promote organic farming, what would that be? Do you think, for example, we ought to move back to a kind of target system where we want to have a target of 10% of land by a certain year, or that? What would you do if you had a few minutes with Keir Starmer?
I would like to see some of the administrative burden of becoming certified as organic. I'd carried by the government, I suppose, or even carried by the larger producers like me, so that small producers can become certified, where it can be prohibitively expensive for the very small ones anyway. I think that's an excuse which is overused, incidentally, for not being organic. So that would be one thing. But my main plea around agriculture is I think there are a tremendous number of citizens, shoppers, who want to support better farming practices, be they organic or, you know, or I'm not saying we have all the solutions, if they were able to. But whilst we have supermarkets who are just lying about where their food comes from and deceiving us, 50% of the milk that you buy in a supermarket comes from cows that never go outside. Around about 85% of salads come from one producer. I mean, the chickens sold by Tesco's under the brand Willow Farm, with a what looks like a free-range chicken walking across the field, are actually produced by a global corporation. Willow Farm is a figment of a marketing executive's imagination. You know, so the story that and the practices of small and medium-sized British farmers who really desperately need the public support and who the public would like to support is that they are unable to tell their story because the supermarkets buy our food as commodities, rebrand it under some fictitious, you know, brand and sell it at a premium. And so what my plea, I just want to see more honesty. I think it should be illegal to deceive the public, and showing a chicken walking across the field from when that chicken has never seen the light of day is clearly deceitful. Calling it Willow Farm when actually it's produced by Cargill, a international corporation, is clearly deceitful. And I would like. I think I've already said that I think honesty and better standards in business and public life are absolutely critical to allowing us, giving us any chance of solving the challenges that we face, be they social or environmental.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. We have about another 5 or 10 minutes. If anyone has any questions to ask or any comments that they want to make in response to what Guy said. Yes, Neil Clark.
Hi there. Guy, I'm curious, in the photos, it looked like on your farm with the employee ownership, it looks like there's perhaps a relatively younger input. I mean, what's your view on the sort of interest in the younger generation in pursuing agricultural careers and how you see that in Riverford?
Yeah, I think there is some hope. I mean, the average age of a British farmer, I think, is certainly, it was 55. I think it's probably pushing 60 now. So I'm fairly typical. And you know, skills are leaving the industry, and it's, you know, it is tough to make a living, particularly at a smaller scale. However, you know, there are lots of people who want to get into agriculture who are not necessarily from farming backgrounds. And I've witnessed some very successful farms where, especially when there's a sort of partnership, be it, you know, a marriage, you know, between you know, an incomer, and where farmers tend to be very inward looking and highly conservative. But they do have the skills to be able to run a farm. And I think when you mix that up with someone who's more outward looking, and, you know, that encourages innovation and change. And I think that can be a very helpful. And so we have apprentices working on our farm. We have apprentices working on our farm, and there is a local training centre, the Apricot Centre, that train people in regenerative, not my favorite word, as I said, agriculture. And so I think there is some hope of attracting people back into the industry. And there is, I think farmers, the new generation, I think there is a lot more sort of innovation. They are less determinedly conservative. I mean, there's a massive increase in soil health and biodiversity, which I find very encouraging. And a lot of that is coming from younger people. So I'm probably, yeah, relatively optimistic about it. Has, you know, most in my sector, vegetables, fruit and veg, you know, most of the work, you will not hear a lot of English spoken in horticulture. Historically, it's been East Europeans, and, you know, Russian was the common language on most vegetable farms. Obviously, with Brexit, that's become much more difficult. So now you have plane loads of Indonesians, often working in questionable conditions and often being exploited. So that's the downside of it. I mean, really, to get more young people back into farming, we need to restructure agriculture. And quite frankly, if these Indonesians were not available, these huge vegetable companies would not exist. I mean, because they're not going to attract UK labour. You know, they've gone back to Victorian employment practices because they've been able to get away with it over the last, you know, 30, 40 years with the influx of East European labour. And, you know, there is a sort of opportunity there, but it would be a very painful transition. And I don't think many farmers would thank me for suggesting that there shouldn't be seasonal agricultural workers permits given out. Personally, I hate the idea that our food is produced by a sort of underclassed living in, you know, dubious conditions. I think we should be ashamed of that. But the transition to making it attractive to UK residents is probably going to be a long one.
Thank you. We've got a question from John Anderson.
What should we do, both individually and nationally, about the supermarkets?
Yeah, well, I think planning law. I mean, we're talking nationally. I do think they've been given too easy a ride in planning applications, and I would love to see that. You know, if you've got a chance to build a supermarket, you had to provide, I don't know, 10% of the parking spaces for local producers to sell their wares in some sort of farmers market. We desperately need to see some diversity. You know, in this 90% of food being sold through supermarkets, and the rest of it, you know, a lot of it going through fairly questionable catering companies. You know, is very unhealthy. We need there to be a market for smaller producers. I'm sorry about the sirens going off in the background. And so, yeah, from the public, you know, government, you know, I think stuff can be done around planning. I think things can be done around honesty and making sure that there is some teeth to what's known as the grocery code of conduct, I think it is, which is supposed to regulate supermarket buying practice, but is completely toothless at the moment. That could be tightened up. And as food shoppers, general public, I mean, I would urge you, and I'm going to come back to the honesty thing, just be a pain in the arse. When you go to a restaurant and they tell you everything is seasonal, local and organic wherever possible, ask them where the French beans come from in January, or, you know, just keep asking questions. I mean, Geeti and I, my wife and I, were in Whole Foods in very upmarket shop in central London this afternoon. And we had 15 minutes to spare, so we used it just making ourselves. You know, why are you selling onions from Holland in August? Why are you selling, you know, Italian apples, you know, in October? It's you know, so just ask those difficult questions. You know, take it out of some of the packaging and leave it on their desk, and, you know, just be asked difficult questions, and, you know, ask them. You know, in particular, Tesco's, who are the worst offenders in terms of fake farms, you know, ask them where Willow Farm is, ask them where Rosedene Farm is. You know, is it in the Netherlands, Morocco, Egypt, or in the UK? Because they sell all, you know, products from all those countries under that cozy sounding brand. Yeah, I don't, it's not going to, you know, change isn't going to come about quickly. But I think we need to demand higher standards, in particular from our supermarkets.
And a couple of questions online from Anthony Roper. I see you've got your hand up as well now. So, Anthony, would you like to voice one or two of your questions?
Yeah, should we be giving, or how can we give more help to small farmers, even these small urban farms that have sprung up? How can we help them to make a significant contribution?
Well, there are, you know, lots of box schemes run by community supported agriculture, and, you know, local farms doing it on a small scale. And, you know, today, most of them are pretty good, actually. I mean, if you go back 10 years, there were some pretty poor growers selling some pretty poor quality food, but I don't think that's true anymore. You know, in farmers markets, farm shops, I mean, but if you do go to a farm shop, again, I would suggest that you do ask the difficult questions. Show me what in this shop is actually produced on this farm. And I'm afraid in many cases you'll find very little. But you know, or indeed what's produced at least locally. Yeah, so, you know, make sure that you're not being a gullible buyer, I suppose. And you don't actually need that many people to be asking those difficult questions before things start changing, actually. You know, I mean, probably, you know, less than 5% of people is quite enough to bring about a change, whether it's writing to your MP or questioning a supermarket or demanding more honesty on how the stuff on your restaurant menu is labeled. So yeah, it is difficult. I think transferring the desire of the general public, you know, to support these smaller businesses, it's very difficult to do that when when I say, you know, so much 90% of the food market has been captured by the supermarkets, and when they would love to give the impression that they're doing it themselves when they are most certainly not. Yeah, so I hope that's some hope, but it's going to be a very difficult transition, I think.
Thank you. Ethel White, you've had your hand up for a few minutes.
Hi there. I'm interested in what's happening on your farm, Guy. How far do you think you'll be able to go in bringing together vegetable production with agroforestry?
Yeah, my experience of intercropping trees with vegetables in the UK has not been particularly successful. I think agroforestry lends itself much more to what I call silvopasture, so grass growing underneath trees and animals grazing in between. And the reason I say that is because we are in relatively northern latitudes, and for most of our crops, sunlight is absolutely critical to success, and most vegetable crops are exceedingly expensive to grow. So, you know, even a modest amount of shading that might reduce your output by, you know, 10 or 20% is going to be the difference between, you know, your business working and it not. So I think as you go further south, and those farmers in, you know, in Uganda, right on the equator, I see it working fantastically well, that, that sort of multi-canopy approach where you might have, forest trees, and then underneath it, be growing bananas, and underneath the bananas be growing a crop of peas or something, or some sort of legume. And it's unbelievably productive. I mean, like 20 times more productive than the monoculture next door. So, I mean, it can be, I think it lends itself much more to more tropical climates than to ourselves. But I think there is potential in the UK, and particularly for grazing. I mean, livestock, love shade. I mean, I've heard my conventional farming neighbours who are, very conservative in nature, even last summer, a pretty miserable summer, saying that their milk yields have gone down because the cows, didn't like the sun when it was hot, and that they were going to plant more trees and give them shade. And this was, so it is, and there is very good scientific evidence that beef cattle and sheep grow faster when they're protected from the wind and the sunshine. So yeah, good, works well, I think, in a silvopasture system. I think there is some potential to grow arable crops amongst in widely spaced rows of trees, because you are then also bringing biodiversity into the field. You'll have more flowering plants in those strips, and you'll get less aphids in your crop, and so on. Yeah, I know. Anyway, I think huge potential for silvopasture.
Thank you. We're coming to an end. I just want to see if anyone's got any final questions. Raise your hand or click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen, or the top if you're on an iPad. I can see one last hand. Yes, Anna and Elf Lewis.
Hi. You've mentioned regenerative farming a couple of times.
Yeah.
I live in North Wales. I've got quite a lot of farmer friends, and they seem to be sort of saying that they're regeneratively farming. But I don't really see much difference to what they've been doing for the past 20, 30 years. I just wondered if you could sort of unpack that a little bit, and what your take on that whole thing is.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think when people start talking about regenerative farming, they are, hoping to farm in a way and produce food in a way which does regenerate nature. Some people even talk about regenerating humans. But I think mostly we're talking about nature, and in particular, we're talking about the soil. So we're talking about less disturbance of the soil, which is definitely something that I think, we should all farmers should aspire to. However, I do think we need to be mindful that when most farmers are saying this, and I'm talking about probably 95% of the acres that are farmed under a regenerative banner, pretty much they're growing the same crops in quite a similar way. But instead of ploughing, they will be spraying off with glyphosate to remove the previous crop and any weeds, and create a weed-free seedbed that they can sow the next crop into. Now, I honestly I don't think I have the information at my disposal to say whether ploughing or glyphosate is worth for the environment. But what annoys me about the regenerative farming lobby is their lack of willingness, their lack of honesty, to actually be clear that that's what regenerative farming is for them. They are, just replacing the plough with a sprayer and using a lot of glyphosate. And it may be that is less damaging to the environment in some circumstances. I don't feel qualified to say. However, glyphosate is definitely bad for the environment. It's definitely bad for mammalian health. Ploughing also definitely has its problems, but it depends a bit on how you plough, when you plough, and how deep you plough. So I do think, that, ploughing more anyway. So that's really the regenerative debate, and there is no accepted definition of it. There's no accepted certification. So whereas, organic is defined in law internationally, you know what you're getting, and it's fairly well regulated, certainly in Northern Europe and mostly throughout the world, I would say. Actually, I would say it was one of the best regulated certification schemes around. Yeah, you know what you're getting. You don't with regenerative farming. So Unilever declared that all their supply chain was going to come from regenerative farming. I can assure you that is nothing like the way that I farm. They are not doing silvopasture. They are not planting new hedgerows. They are not looking after their ponds and whatever. It does sometimes get me a bit hot under the collar. Having said that, I do every year go to the Groundswell, which is the festival of regenerative agriculture, and I always learn quite a lot. I'm just a bit bemused by the absolute determination not to discuss glyphosate. It just seems completely bizarre to me, but yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we must end the discussion and conversation there. It's been an absolutely fascinating evening. I'm sure everyone would agree that to have someone like you who knows so much about the subject and from a practical perspective, not an ivory tower academic like me, it's been really, really helpful. And so please do put your hands together virtually or in reality for Guy Singh-Watson. Thank you very much indeed for the expertise you share with us tonight.
Even my wife's clapping.
Praise indeed. We have a couple of notices. I'm going to pass on to Kat on this.
Can I just say, Tim, I don't see how anyone can be a Christian without being an environmentalist, and so that's why I see very little correlation between people professing to be Christians and any sort of environmental behavior. So I congratulate you on this group, and that's why I agreed to speak. So, you know, if the Lord's created this planet, surely it's incumbent upon us to look after it, and we're doing a pretty awful job.
Thank you, Guy. We have been beavering away for the last 40-odd years, trying to communicate that very same message that as a Christian, we ought to be concerned. It is getting across. Even the dear old church commissioners, it was interesting to hear your own personal story, are listening a bit more, where they've changed very much, but there is some signs of progress. The dear old church.
I should say my comments are well out of date. You know, I'm talking about 20 years ago. They may well have changed their behaviour, but yeah. Well,
slowly, Guy, slowly. Yeah. Over to you, Kat.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, and thank you, Guy. That was really fascinating discussion. So we really appreciate your time.